Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is part 2 of an oncology series presented by Clario entitled Using Scientific Validation to Move the Needle on Accessibility Functionalities. My name is Ryan Muse and I'll be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes, and this presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. Now, the webinar is designed to be interactive, and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit your questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. And if you require any assistance along the way, you can contact me at any time by sending a message using the same chat panel. At this time, know that all participants are in listen-only mode, and please note that the event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Clario, who developed the content for this presentation. Clario is a leading healthcare research and technology company that generates the richest clinical evidence in the industry. Across decentralized, hybrid, and site-based clinical trials, Clario's deep scientific expertise, global scale, and the broadest endpoint technology platform allow their partners to transform lives. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Brian McDowell brings extensive experience and expertise to achieve smarter drug development, clinical trial design, and execution to vastly expand the reach and access of trials to more patients, provide improved patient experience, and data quality to deliver accelerated drug and device development programs. Joe Pavone is the program lead of Digital Health Technologies Operations at Regeneron, where he manages and supports local and global clinical trial services and study management teams. Joe has 25 plus years of pharmaceutical industry experience, having held roles as Global ePro Project Manager and Program Lead for eCOA Operations. Dr. Kelly Dumais is a scientist with over 13 years of experience in the behavioral and life science research. She has expertise in the implementation of electronic clinical outcome assessments and the development and validation of patient-reported outcomes to support labeling claims. She is currently the Director of eCOA Science and Consulting at Clario, working on best practices for questionnaire design and eCOA design. And Dr. Sarah Tressel-Gary has over 12 years of experience in clinical trial design and strategy, and more than 11 years of experience in ePro and the development and validation of pros in support of labeling claims. She has significant experience working with pro development and validation studies, questionnaire design, and working with developers of standardized instruments. But without further ado, let's go ahead and hand things over to our moderator for today's event. Brian McDowell, you may begin when you're ready.
So first and foremost, thank you all very much indeed for being here for this exciting and interesting webinar. As a little bit of background about myself, as Ryan said, I've been in the industry for well over 20 years. And part of that time, we've seen huge advances in the technology and the way we can capture information and capture data to help inform our decisions on drug development and whether to move it forward or not. I've always looked at technology as the way to engage with patients more directly, particularly around the ePro area. And I'm lucky enough to head up the science team, eCOA science team here at Clario. As we look towards technologies and clinical trials in general, we should always be looking to see how we can include patients, include people from around the world to take part in trials, and ensuring that the methodologies and approaches and tools and instruments that we use to collect the important data is indeed accessible and usable by the participants in trials. So as we go forward and start to look at the agenda for today, on the next slide, we're going to talk about some of the key areas that we've looked at and worked in over the course of this year. First, we're going to discuss what is accessibility. What does that mean in general to the industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, and within clinical trials? Kelly is then going to walk through the accessibility research background and rationale of what we've done to help advance this within the industry and for the benefit of the industry in clinical trials. And then we will look at those results in due course and talk about next steps. So maybe if we want to start looking at accessibility, what does this mean in terms of overall use within clinical trials? So accessibility really promotes the inclusion of patients in clinical trials, irrespective of geography, irrespective of potential impairments and disabilities or other disadvantages that may hinder or make people uncomfortable or challenged to take part in trials. So accessibility really is inclusion of patients. As those of you who may have heard me at other talks, I always like to say collecting the right data, the right time, the right frequency, and the right location. But more importantly, it's also from the right patients and right people as well. Accessibility offers that fifth part of the overall dimensions to be able to get this all-important data, ensure data integrity, and help drive and bring new drugs to the market and treatments to the market to help extend and improve the lives of millions around the world. When we look at the two sort of funnels down the left and right, one of the accessibility components, of course, we've seen is access to trials. Patients who need to have access to trials, we've seen that this is being supported with flexible trial designs, such as decentralized trials and hybrid versions. But equally on the right-hand side, with the completion of assessments during the trial, what does this look like? How can patients best do this completion? What difficulties or challenges may patients have to complete these assessments, and how can we, within the industry, help support ensuring that these assessments can be done in the comfort and ease of patients. So overall, irrespective of where the patient would be in geography, whether there are impairments, disabilities, or other disadvantages, we should be able to include patients into these studies and ensure that the assessments and technologies that are being provided are there to support the patients and ensure they have a good experience and a better experience and journey throughout the clinical trial. The accessibility in terms of geography, again, as I mentioned, is from flexible trial design, which includes hybrid and DCT versions. And then on the right-hand side, we have accessibility functionality. These are additional enhancements to the technologies that can be used to support patients' journey through the trial and enable collecting better data from these patients while maintaining data integrity. So as we see on the next slide, as we go forward, there has been a change in the landscape of trials. Primarily, as we go back a number of years ago, we had the site-based trials and before conventional trials that declined from most studies around. As we moved through, particularly during COVID, we did see a change into flexible trials. Again, these are decentralized trials or hybrid trials that have existed. And on the right-hand side, we see the hybrid trial and in-home trial really are taking a lot of the space within the clinical trial environment and landscape, and are becoming more and more important to ensure that when outcomes are being captured outside of the site, that the journey, the experience, and the technology is suited to include and have accessibility functionality included into those technologies to best support patients complete and capture the outcomes that are only too important to all studies and clinical development programs. So when we look and go forward onto the next slide here, we'll be able to understand what are the couple of differences here. And it's quite often there's a belief that a digitalized trial and flexible trial design, flexible clinical trials such as decentralized or hybrid, are the same. They're not really the same. A digitalized trial really focuses in on the technologies, which here at Clario we do this. We hone in on making sure we capture the right outcomes through the best technologies that are there, along with being able to consider the accessibility of patients into these. With the flexible clinical trial design, we look at this more of an operational decision of where the trial will be done. It can theoretically be done without digitalization. I would never ever recommend that. That would be an overwhelming burden. But the clear message down the bottom, as we get a greater overlap between digitalization, the use of technologies, and flexible trial design such as DCT and hybrid, the greater the efficiencies that we can have in general to drive clinical trials and hopefully bring new and innovative treatments to the market faster based upon quality data, data-driven decisions, and of course, maintaining and ensuring data integrity so we're capturing the correct data. So what does all this do? The next slide, we see what the benefits of some of these aspects are from a patient perspective and from the industry perspective. First of all, from the patient experience, if set up correctly and following the right guidelines, and of course, as we look upon the regulatory guidelines, there is a much bigger demand for including accessibility functionalities into these tools. We've seen this clearly from the FDA and other regulatory bodies around the world. We're also seeing a greater request for this from our clients as well. Overall, though, the goal is to improve the patient experience, to ensure that we can conduct a trial and capture data anywhere, reduce burden for patients, this is always clear, and most importantly, by having good and well thought out trial design and data capture methodologies, we want to increase the engagement and the satisfaction of the patient going through the journey, going through the experience. Nobody wants to be in a clinical trial. They'd rather be healthy and in good shape and not have to enter into a trial. We need to ensure that for those patients that do enter into a trial, they have the best possible experience with the greatest accessibility, always feeling included, never feeling excluded. From the sponsor perspective, of course, by having more accessibility in general, we will have improved recruitment. By having good and well thought out functionalities and technologies, retention will be there as well. By reaching out and including more patients wherever they might be or whether they may have impairments, we will have the diversity that's being very much requested from regulatory bodies as well to get a much better view of the real world and patients within the real world to collect the data. This improves quality data and includes and increases compliance for the completion of data to give you better quality and more complete data as we go forward. Overall, happier patients, well thought out technology, greater accessibility, better functionality, and a well thought out technical and eCOA solution will help support faster studies, which inevitably will bring, hopefully with the right results, bring new drugs to the market faster in that respect. This, of course, is applicable across the board, including oncology as well. And we will see as we go forward, and I hand over to Kelly to walk us through one of the industry first studies that has been done to improve and assess the importance and ability to add in additional accessibility functionalities to the study. So with that, Kelly and Joe, may I hand over to both of you to walk us through the research background and rationale?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I'm very happy to be joined here by Joe Pavone, again, Program Lead for Digital Health Technology Operations at Regeneron. And as I go through the research that Clario has conducted, I'll be inviting him to provide some of his insights and perspectives as I go through the presentation. So yeah, Brian has done just a fantastic job giving an overview of what does accessibility mean, and it can mean a lot of things, right? So now I'll be talking a bit more specifically about how technology and eCOA devices can aid in accessibility, and how I think we as technology providers have a role and a responsibility to do our part to make clinical trials more accessible. And that's exactly what Clario has sought out to do, and what I'll be discussing. So to provide a little bit more background on what the regulators' thoughts are on accessibility. So regulatory bodies have voiced their opinions about the need for making clinical trials more accessible, right? So over the years, regulatory agencies have been emphasizing the importance of putting patients first, them at the forefront, and designing more patient-centered trials. And this patient-focused drug development guidance 3 that's in draft form has gone further and really highlights that accessibility features should be incorporated so that COA can be accessed and understood. They state right in here in the context of COAs, universal design considerations for COAs should be put forth so that the COA is accessed, understood, and used to the greatest extent possible by all people, inclusive of those with disabilities. So again, this is just a small part of the greater effort to make clinical trials more inclusive and diverse, so that the clinical trial population better matches the real world population. And so not only are we seeing the regulatory bodies, demanding accessibility, but sponsors are asking for the functionality too. So sponsors are increasingly asking for accessibility functionalities to facilitate the use of our devices by those who may have certain impairments, either caused by age, medication, the condition. So accessibility features can support the inclusion of patients who might have visual impairments or hearing difficulties or dexterity issues. And currently, there are, I think, limited options or suboptimal options for those who have certain impairments to be able to participate and complete questionnaires on devices, right? For example, for those with severe motor dexterity issues or severe vision impairments, they might be left to report via caregiver report. And we know that that's not the ideal method for a patient-reported outcome. So I'll now invite Joe in as well. So I'll ask you, how does Regeneron define accessibility, and what is Regeneron doing in this area of accessibility functionality?
Sure, Kelly. Thanks for the question. So at Regeneron, we define accessibility as ease with which participants, including those with diverse abilities, can complete and understand the questionnaires. This involves even designing homegrown questionnaires that are accessible to individuals with varying disabilities, providing clear instructions and using inclusive formats. We are ensuring accessibility enhances the reliability and relevance of data collected, contributing to a more comprehensive understanding of the trial's outcomes across a diverse population.
Yeah, that's important. You mentioned already kind of the data integrity piece a little bit to make sure that it's relevant, and so I think that leads very nicely into why Clario has done the research that we did today. So with the advancement of technology, we have these new types of opportunities to increase accessibility and also improve the clinical trial experience, I think, overall. But currently, I think these opportunities are often seen as challenges or risks. For example, we see accessibility features in our daily lives all the time, right, on our web browsers, on our smartphones, but we rarely see them being used in clinical trials. And why is that? I think a large part is because we don't know how they might impact data integrity, right? So including accessibility features could change the way the COA questionnaires are presented. And if the presentation or mode of collection is changing, industry best practice tells us that validation of that new mode or presentation might be required, right? So we can simply turn these features on a device, but without validating them first, we could risk data integrity. So scientific review really needs to happen first, and only then can we ensure that accessibility functionality does not impact data integrity in a negative way. And this scientific validation is not new, right? So the scientific review and validation to preserve data integrity has been the cornerstone of all ECOA scientific research to date. So even to get to today's widespread use of ECOA, we had to first scientifically test that migrating a PRO from paper to an electronic mode did not bias the participants' responses, right? We then had to test all of the different components of ECOA, such as comparability of all of the different response scale types, like the NRS and the VAS and the VRS, and across different devices. Does implementing BYOD and having that range of devices impact data integrity? How about scrolling? And so we've had to systematically test all of these different ECOA features, so to say, the device equivalent, scrolling, and they've all been determined to not impact data integrity from consistent scientific research. And so now, I think now is the time to test these accessibility features. So all of this prior work has kind of set, I think, that strong precedent for the need for scientific rigor then when implementing ECOA features like accessibility features. So we've taken up the baton, and now we're excited to share the results of research that we've undertaken here at Clario. So where did we begin? I keep talking about accessibility features. So what accessibility features? So we began with, I think, one of the most frequently requested feature by our sponsors, which is the zoom in and out feature. So, the functionality by which you use your fingers on the device's touch screen and pinch them to make the information bigger on the screen. So zooming in and out. And I think this could really significantly help those with visual impairments, for which there are currently, as I mentioned, kind of limited or unsatisfactory options for them to self-complete electronic PROs. And again, it's a feature that we use in everyday life, right? It's almost expected that maybe a questionnaire on our device that when they participate in a clinical trial might have that, because it's something that we use all of the time in our day-to-day lives, but its impact to data integrity has not yet been tested. So we haven't seen it within the context of a clinical trial. So our objective in this study was to assess the measurement equivalence or comparability of an ePro instrument, both with and without the pre-activated zoom in, zoom out functionality. And then we also wanted to gather information about their patient's experience with it as well. So we did collect some user experience data as well, which I'll go over. So the study methodology. So in order to show that the zoom in, zoom out feature does not change the way participants respond to questions. We need to show that their answers are the same, whether they complete a questionnaire with the zoom in functionality versus when they complete a questionnaire without the zoom in functionality, right? And this type of methodology is what has been used for most all of the ePro to, or the paper to ePro comparability testing that's been done in the past. So we had participants complete the same questionnaire twice, one with and one without Zoom. And if they gave the same answers, we know that the data is comparable, that implementing the Zoom in feature alone did not change the way they respond to questions. So we used one instrument, we used the SF20, which is a general quality of life questionnaire, mainly consisting of verbal response scales, like the Likert scale type of response options. And then because we wanted to test all different response scale types, we also added a pain VAS and a pain NRS as well. So we had 53 participants participate in this part of the equivalence testing. We had half of the patients first complete this assessment without zoom in, so just how we normally would implement it. We then had a washout task, so a distraction task, and this is to kind of wipe their short-term memory. And then after that, we had them complete, again, the same questionnaire, but this time with the zoom in feature. So when it was zoomed in like this, the zoom in was locked in the most zoomed in setting. And this was to be sure to show equivalence in the most extreme case of the zoom in feature. So then we just counterbalance it so that the other half of participants first completed the assessment with the zoom in already, with the questionnaire already zoomed in. Again, they did the distraction task, and then they completed the same questionnaire without the zoom in and just the normal questionnaire. And then we also implemented exit interviews such that we took a subset of the 53 participants, n equals 10, and those participants were then given the opportunity to actually use the zoom in, zoom out feature and play around with it and understand how it works and use it. And then they participated in a semi-structured interview. So again, we could get that information on the usability and the ease of use, etc. So these were our results. So first, just quickly, these are our participant demographics. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but what I'll probably want to point you to is that we did purposefully want to recruit participants that had some visual impairment, such that they self-reported that they had wore corrective measures for eyesight. And so almost 70% of our participants did wear corrective measures for eyesight. I thought that was important. We also had a fairly big age range as well, between 28 and 80. And again, it was 53 participants who participated in this part. So these are our top line results, and this is what we're most excited about. We did show equivalence or comparability. Looking at, a correlation table is incredibly exciting, so I'll try to walk you through this. So again, the point is that we did not want the implementation of the zoom in feature itself to change the way participants responded, right? So by showing that participants responded the same way, we could then confidently say that the zoom in feature didn't negatively impact the data. So to answer that question, we want the answers to be the same. So we look at the correlation between answers given when the zoom in feature was enabled versus when it wasn't. A high correlation would show similarity in responses, and that was what we were looking for. So a correlation of above 0.8 is good, above 0.9 is great. And we show that the correlation coefficient here for all of the different response scale types, so the VAS, the NRS, and the verbal response scale, the correlation coefficient was all above 0.9. And then the 95% confidence interval for all was above 0.8. So overall, these are very strong findings. We can confidently say then that the patients respond to questions when using the zoom in and zoom out feature similarly to when it's not implemented, thereby concluding that it doesn't negatively impact the data. So I'll also bring in Joe again at this point, looking at these results. I mean, is this the kind of result that sponsors need to see for them to start using the zoom in functionality confidently in their studies within these certain parameters?
Yeah, Kelly, and I think you said it before too, this evidence is really needed to prove that there are no major changes in how the questionnaires are being answered based on the functionality being used. So I would say yes, it is needed.
Great. And then, you know, in your opinion, do you see this as a useful feature for oncology studies? I know this webinar isn't within the context of oncology, so want to make that, you know, connection there too. But then in addition to oncology, you know, what other indications or therapy areas do you see this functionality being used in?
Yeah, Kelly, not just oncology. I think any and all therapeutic areas. I think as this opens up the playing field for any participant who struggle with vision impairments for any indication for any study.
Yeah, it's a good point. So those with vision impairment isn't just maybe an ophthalmology indication. It could be, you know, and that's all about accessibility and inclusion. Any therapy area that you're recruiting for could have patients with vision impairments. Very actually common thing, and a lot of vision impairment can be corrective, and you know, you could wear glasses or contacts, but maybe that patient forgot their glasses that day, or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
You're right. That's a good point. I do think that it would be, you know, useful, not it isn't confined within any one therapy area or indication. It could be useful kind of across the board. Thanks, Joe. So then my last couple slides on the results are showing the results of that usability part of the study that we did. So we did, as a reminder, we for a subset of the participants, for 10 of them, we then asked them to go ahead and use the functionality and play around with the functionality, and then we asked them some questions on their usability. So for this one, we asked, you know, how easy or difficult was the zoom in feature to use overall? Excuse me. And on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being very difficult and 5 being very easy, everyone reported either a 4 or 5, indicating that it was quite easy to use. And I really love some of the quotes that we got from this. You know, I didn't have to think about it. It was very intuitive. There's nothing new or unfamiliar about it. I think this really speaks to the fact that, you know, we use zoom in and out all the time in our daily lives, like I said. You don't have to learn how to do it by habit more than anything else. So I think this kind of just speaks to the fact that patients are quite comfortable with using this type of functionality, and it's very easy to use. And then one of the other questions we asked was, you know, did you find the zoom in, zoom out feature to be useful? And this was on a scale from 1 being not useful to 5 being very useful. And again, everyone reported a 3, 4, or 5, indicating that it was useful. And then when we asked the question, and we asked patients to think about their vision impairment, again, within the context of their visual impairment, would the feature be useful? And they reported even higher responses, skewing more towards the right, so even more towards the very useful. And again, the quotes here were good. I mean, I did find it easier to read the text even with my glasses off. So it would be, you know, this shows that I think it does have value to patients that might be having any level of visual impairment to be able to make the text bigger like that. So again, Joe, I'll invite you in to ask you your thoughts. I mean, this is just, I know, one accessibility feature. What else do you think the industry needs to do to kind of move the needle further, so to say, on increasing accessibility?
There's so many, but I mean, overall, I mean, to improve the accessibility for people with disabilities and filling out questionnaires, I think the pharmaceutical industry should adopt inclusive design principles. I mean, this includes providing alternative formats for questionnaires and ensuring the compatibility with assistive technologies. I mean, engaging people with disabilities in the design and testing phases can also lead to more user-friendly and accessible questionnaire formats.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I hear that a lot in our industry, you know, engaging patients early, you know, test these features out on them early and really include them in the design early on, so that that your design is really conducive to having them able to participate in as easy a way as possible. That's great. Thank you so much, Joe. So our next part of the results were part of that distraction task questionnaire, and I will let Sarah introduce what that questionnaire was and go through the results. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. So if you recall in Kelly's slide where she presented on the methodology, in between the two periods where they completed with or without the Zoom, there was an intermission period. And during this time, we did some distraction tasks in order to wipe their short-term memory so they forgot what they did during the first period. And so during that intermission, the distraction task that we completed included a communication questionnaire. And really what we were trying to get at with this communication questionnaire was their preferences for communication with their friends and family, as well as with their physician and healthcare provider. And we also wanted to know what other accessibility features that they used. Next slide, please. So for the first question we asked them, we asked, what method do you most prefer to use to communicate with, one, your friends and family, and two, your physician or healthcare provider? So first, looking at friends and family in the dark purple, we can see that they mostly prefer to communicate using WhatsApp. This could reflect a regional preference due to it mostly being conducted in Ireland. But this is also a form of text messaging. So we might see more text messaging if this was conducted in the US. So overall, I would say that the friends and family, the preference was through a text message service like WhatsApp. And then looking at communication with their physician or healthcare provider in pink, you can see that in this case, they most preferred to communicate with the physician using a phone call. So if you go to the next slide. So next we asked them, how often do you use the following modalities when communicating with friends and family? So you can see that more than 50% of the participants very often use text messaging. But looking at the other modalities, you can see about 30 to 50% at least somewhat often use the speech to text messaging, the voice memos, and the video messaging, suggesting that there is some familiarity with these other modalities. If you go to the next slide. So next we asked them, if you were participating in a clinical trial and had to use a messaging system to communicate with your physician, what would be your preferred method of messaging? And we asked them to rank this from 1 being most preferred to 4 being least preferred. So focusing on the most preferred, the number 1, we can see that the majority preferred typing text messages. And looking at the least preferred, we can see that the least preferred really was the speech to text messages and the voice memo. If you go to the next slide. And then we asked, if you were participating in a clinical trial that required you to answer questions about your symptoms while at home, what would be your preferred method to report symptoms? Again, ranking 1 being most preferred to 4 least preferred. So looking at the most preferred, you can see that it's really split about 50-50 between a touchscreen to select an answer on a device or smartphone, as well as between phone video call with your physician. And so this really reflects a preference for independent reporting, as well as live communication with their physician, which could reflect the rising use of telehealth as well. Next slide. And then here we're asking, if you were participating in a clinical trial that required you to answer questions about your symptoms while at home, what would be your preferred device to report these symptoms? Ranking 1 being most preferred to 5 least preferred. And looking at the most preferred, we see a majority, 73%, really preferred to use their own smartphone. And this is similar to what we've seen in other surveys on a bring your own device model, where the majority really do want that choice of being able to use their own phone. But I think it's also important to have a provision device as well for those that they're 30% that don't want to use their own smartphone or do not have access to an appropriate device to report symptoms while at home. Next slide. And then finally, we asked, if you were participating in a clinical trial that required you to answer questions about your symptoms on an electronic device while at home, would you be interested in, on the left here, having the device read the questions and answer options aloud? And you can see, about 36% said yes, they would be interested in this. And then answering the questions verbally, for example, using a voice assistant to select the answer. And over 40% were interested in this method as well. And I think there are a lot of use cases for this type of technology. It could be a particular therapeutic area where they have severe vision impairment and the zooming in wouldn't be good enough for them, or even for participants who are illiterate and they need the questions read aloud to them. So I think this is a really interesting result, that there is interest in some of these methodologies, and further research is really needed to explore incorporating these technologies to improve accessibility, usability, engagement in clinical trials. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll hand it back over to Brian to discuss next steps.
Thank you very much indeed, Kelly, Joe, and Sarah, for looking over the results of that very interesting and critical study to help improve accessibility within the ECO and ePro environment. So clearly, when we look at the accessibility functionalities that exist, this is the first step in many efforts that we need to take to really improve and ensure accessibility for patients is put into place across the board. And as we see in the next slide, we've also done other research, and it's an indication of the various spectrum, or the spectrum across what needs to be done from a scientific perspective across the board. So we look at light-dark mode. This is light-dark mode is where the dark mode reduces the amount of light emitted by the device, which can help patients who maybe have sensitivities to light, potentially during migraines or other areas where they would rather turn on the dark mode to answer the questions within the ePro device. We've looked at this from a scientific perspective, and we've identified and written our scientific position that there is no need to do a full validation study, such as we've done an equivalent study, such as we've done for the zoom in, zoom out functionality. But at the same time, we did ensure that we looked carefully from a scientific perspective whether enabling a light dark mode could potentially impact the results and the data being collected. And it doesn't, is the outcome of this. What it does reflect is we can't just go into these accessibility features and expect them to produce the same data all the time. We do need to look at this in a comprehensive and scientific fashion to ensure that data integrity is maintained, irrespective of what the accessibility functionalities and changes to the potential, the ePro questionnaires, the presentation of those could potentially involve. Therefore, we look at this light dark mode. A relatively light scientific evaluation, yet it was done. We then looked at the zoom in, zoom out, and it was a complete and full-on clinical trial was required to ensure that the data integrity was not jeopardized and would be maintained in the right settings for the zoom in, zoom out components. So we start to look at the next steps. So what else can we do? We'll see these on the next slide here. There's a number of different areas that are coming through with this. We do need to look at different components, and down the bottom we see the screen reader and voice and language selection, which is where we will be looking at next, and looking to our colleagues and partners within the industry to work with us to help advance accessibility with data integrity as we go forward. But what is important, that is not all zoom in, zoom out functions are the same. And of course, beyond the best practices that Kelly spoke about as well, we do need to consider how this functionality works. Again, to ensure that data integrity and safeguards are in place to maintain and ensure the right data is collected and is valid. There are parameters that are involved with zoom in, zoom out, such as upper end of text size, and also vertical guardrails to ensure that the scrolling functionality is required and it's not vertical and horizontal zooming. To that end, we'd ask to make sure that if this zoom in, zoom out is being used, that you check that these parameters are in place with the provider. And we at Clario, recognizing and supporting the importance of data integrity, providing the right technology in the right way with the right accessibility functionalities in place, while maintaining and putting data integrity at the forefront with the patient at the heart of the study. We will continue to do this and work aggressively and progressively to advance the ability for patients, irrespective of impairments and disadvantages, to take part in trials, to capture a greater diversity, a better data range for the trials, and be more representative of the real world population. So with that, I'm going to hand back over to Ryan, who will moderate for the questions and answers session.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, for that wonderful presentation. I'd like to invite our audience to continue to send their questions or comments right now using the questions window for this Q&A portion of our webinar. Now, I've already received some questions from the audience, so we'll get ourselves started with those. The very first question that I have for you all here would like to know, do we expect regional or cultural differences in participant preferences for communication methods, considering the study was only conducted in Ireland?
So maybe I'll take this one first. I think in essence what we all should know and understand is there are going to be cultural differences irrespective of whether it's from an individual country or not, as we see populations moving around the world more. But it is reflective of culture, and culture is something we do need to take into consideration in trials. What this study has shown certainly is that we do need to understand these cultures, make the accessibility functionalities incorporative of the cultures that are in play, and recognize there are differences, not just within a culture, but at an individual level. And most importantly, irrespective of cultural preferences or attributes, it's the patient's choice of how we can best support them, and giving the patients the choice of how they can be engaged and have a good journey and experience in clinical trials is paramount. So cultural differences we need to understand that may result in providing devices, different devices or different modalities depending on culture. But overall, it comes down to having the armory to be able to provide patient accessibility that will enable them to have the patient choice of what happens.
All right, very good. Thank you so much. So the next question here is curious if you foresee, do you foresee to implement this feature in all studies or only if the customer requests it?
I can
Go
take
ahead,
that
Kelly.
one if you'd like. Sure. Yeah, I think to Joe's point actually during the research presentation part was that it seems like, you know, this could be applicable to a wide variety of indications, therapy areas. So I think we as Clario believe that it should be just implemented in all studies as a default, to be in line with the regulatory guidance on increasing accessibility, and again, to the patient's choice, as Brian mentioned too, that maybe not everyone would use it or wants to use it, but it's the fact that we're offering it as an option for those that need it or just want it. But I think it's important, you know, if a sponsor doesn't want to use it, you know, we can turn it off as well. So I think as a default, it would be great for this to be included as default, and that's what we would plan to do, with it having the ability to be turned off if a customer requests for it to be turned off.
Oh, very interesting. Thank you so much for your answer to that one. Next, someone here says that you mentioned scrolling, but outside of the zoom in, zoom out functionality, what are the reasons for implementing a screen where you need to scroll?
I can jump in for that one too, if you
Sure.
want. Sure. So yeah, I think as a best practice, we try to avoid scrolling when we can, right? If we don't need to have scrolling, it's best to avoid it. But sometimes it is unavoidable. And for example, you know, questions, and if it's a question and answer options that are, you know, maybe unusually long, there's 5 answer options and they take a couple of lines for each answer options. You kind of have no choice but to either split it on 2 screens, which is definitely not ideal if it's one question, or make the font size so small they could barely read it, right, to fit it on one screen, or you could scroll. So I think at the expense of making it unreadable, that wouldn't be appropriate at all. So if it is a question and answer option that if you had to fit it on one screen, the font would be too small, you of course should have an appropriate font size and then implement the scrolling option. That being said, there are, you know, kind of smart scrolling rules as well. So when you do implement something like scrolling, it is important to use these type of smart scrolling best practices such that you should require the participant to scroll down, to read all of the response options prior to choosing one and moving forward, right? So there's multiple different ways you could do that. You could kind of gray out the next and have them scroll all the way down before the next becomes available. You can also, a best practice could be actually including an indicator that they need to scroll down, right? So there's multiple ways to accommodate the fact that participants should view the whole screen before, going next. And so I'd say whenever you are implementing scrolling, just making sure those types of smart scrolling methodologies are being used.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much for outlining that for them. I'm sure they appreciate it. Another question here is wondering in regards to zooming in, does the line used as the VAS get increased when zooming in?
Mike, I can start on that, and then Kelly, Sarah, Joe, feel free to jump in. No, the line remains the same size. It's the text around it that is enlarged, but it's kept within the parameters and the build and specifications, so that the left anchor and the right anchor, the text associated there is not overlapping, and there's no confusion between which end means what. So the line remains the same size, but the supportive text around it increases to enable the patient to see it and read it more accurately.
Okay, very good, thank you. Now, someone here for our next question is wondering what is next to continue to advance patient inclusion and accessibility?
I take that one briefly, and again, happy for any of the other panel to jump in. I think as we saw on the last slide of the presentation, we are continuing to advance here at Clario. The great work and scientific review of additional accessibility features such as screen reader and also voice and language selection. We will continue to do this, and as we recognize additional potentially other components or accessibility functions that are outside of the norm, we will continue to look at these and continue to assess the efforts needed to ensure that data integrity is maintained, that things can be set up accurately, usefully, and correctly to ensure the patient has that good experience that can use these features easily. We want to avoid having features that are just very difficult to use. As we saw with the zoom in, zoom out functionality, the ease of use was very highly marked. So we've got to keep that in mind. We can't have complicated accessibility functionalities in there. That will sort of defeat the purpose. So we will work forward with that. We will be reaching out, as I said, to our partners and colleagues around the industry to discuss what these accessibility functionalities may look like and how we can best do that to make sure we cover as much as possible within the first version, if I may put it that way, that comes out.
That's great. Thank you so much for that answer and for all of the answers today. However, we have reached the end of the Q&A portion for our webinar. And as a reminder to our audience, there is more in this oncology series by Clario that you are already registered for. It's part 3, integrating objectively measured safety endpoints and patient-reported outcomes in oncology trials, which is scheduled for Wednesday, December 13th. So remember to come on back for that. For today, though, if we couldn't attend to your questions, know that the team at Clario will follow up with you, or if you have some further questions, you can direct them to the email address or visit the website that's going to be up on your screen. I want to thank everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen as you exit, and your participation is appreciated as it helps us to improve our webinars. Additionally, there is a link to view the recording of this event, which I have placed in the chat box for you, so you can share this link with your colleagues so that they may register for the recording for this series as well. So please join me, though, once more in thanking our speakers for their wonderful time here today. We hope that you all found the webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.